When you think of RPGs made by Square Enix, typically the first thing that come to mind would be the Final Fantasy series. Others may think of Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest or whatever it's called nowadays. If I were to ask you to think back when Square Enix was two separate companies and think about RPGs made by what was at the time Squaresoft, you'd probably think of some titles such as Secret of Mana, Xenogears, or Parasite Eve, all of which are certainly notable titles that I probably should take a look at some point. But somewhere in the conversation, whether it be sooner or later, Chrono Trigger is going to come up. Not only do I consider Chrono Trigger to be objectively one of the best RPGs ever, even though I personally like Final Fantasy VI just a little bit more as it hits more of the right notes for me, I think the game has achieved a unique status where every time I hear people talk about it, it's nothing but positive. Even the more acclaimed RPGs like the great Final Fantasy VII are typically more polarizing, with one side praising it and another side bashing it, and a sort of middle ground pointing out the pros and cons. With Chrono Trigger, I have yet to hear anyone bring up anything majorly negative, and it certainly proved to be a commercial success, selling over 3.5 million copies as of 2018. Square Enix had made something truly special with this title, so it was only natural that they would attempt some sort of sequel or successor at some point.
Greetings people, 'tis I, 480 volts, and today we are taking a look at Chrono Cross, the sequel to the 1995 classic Chrono Trigger.
Now, before we get too deep into this, I should point out that this game was not Square's first attempt at a sequel to Chrono Trigger. In 1996, Square released a game for the Super Nintendo called Radical Dreamers. It wasn't so much a standard RPG though, it was more like an interactive book that you read with RPG elements thrown into it. It follows the adventure of a band of thieves called the Radical Dreamers, and very loosely ties in with Trigger's storyline. However, the game did not achieve the greatest commercial success and remained exclusive to Japan, fan hacks and translations aside, until 2022 when it was finally released internationally, bundled with Chrono Cross's multi-platform release. As for Cross, it was initially released for the Sony PlayStation in 1999.
But the big question is this game a worthy successor to one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and is it still worth playing today? Well, let's find out.
Now, before I dive into the complex web that is this game's story, let me say that if you don't want stuff spoiled for you, check the timestamps in the description to bypass all of this. But also know that I will be referencing Chrono Trigger's story as well, so if you've never played that game and don't want certain parts of it spoiled either, just know that I will be referencing a few plot points at times. You've been warned, now let's get into it. Basically, it takes Dreamer's story and expands the mess out of it.
It's like Dreamer's storyline is a cookie, and then Cross just comes in and starts adding layers and layers to it and expanding it and turns it into a full-blown wedding cake.
It features most of the key characters from Dreamers and most of the concepts as well. The overall tone of the game feels a bit less cartoony than Trigger, but is no less fantasy-driven with a sci-fi twist. Like sci-fi elements explain classic RPG tropes like prophecies and chosen ones, but at the same time this game literally has dwarves, fairies, mermaids, and dragons. Our cast of characters is completely removed from Trigger, although a few folks like Glenn, Lucia, Guiel, and Leia were obviously based off of characters from Trigger. The game takes place in an archipelago called El Nido and is set some 20 years after the events of Trigger. Well, to be more accurate, the one time period in Trigger that was home to Chrono, Marl, and Luca, considering that the game took place across 6 different time periods, 7 if you count the end of time. The game begins with a cold opening, throwing you in the control of a 3-man party traversing some sort of ruined fortress. After fighting some enemies and throwing a few switches, we see one party member suddenly lying face down on the floor while another member holds a bloody knife. Did I mention that this game is also a bit darker than Trigger? And since we don't have Ted Woosley censoring everything anymore, be prepared for some mildly PG-13 language. Anyway, this whole thing turns out to be a dream had by a teenage boy named Serge, the holder of the aforementioned bloody knife. Interestingly enough, Serge is completely silent in this game and never utters so much as a word, much like his predecessor from Trigger, but ironically, he's the narrator of Dreamers. Anyway, Serge is living a quiet and peaceful life with his mom in the small tropical village of Arnie. Everything is casual and tranquil until his best friend Lena asks to meet him by the beach after he's collected some scales that she can make into a necklace. Serge and Lena are peacefully enjoying the beach when a large wave rolls up. Serge passes out and awakens to find that Lena is nowhere to be found. He heads back to Arnie Village where he learns that not only are certain key details different now, folks talking about being in a drought when earlier they were complaining about too much rain for example, nobody here recognizes him, not even Lena. After talking to enough people, he learns that everyone here is under the impression that the boy they all knew as Serge drowned 10 years ago. Given that this is a sequel to a game primarily about time travel, you might now assume that Serge was teleported 10 years into the future back on the beach, but considering no one seems to have aged, teenage Lena included, that can't be the case. Serge then takes a walk to a nearby rock summit where he sees his own tombstone confirming that he did in fact die 10 years ago. At this point, he is met by a group of knights led by a man named Karsh, who order him to come with them to Viper Manor for questioning. Then a young girl appears looking not unlike the girl who was stabbed in Serge's dream. She smarts off to Karsh and helps Serge defend himself against the knights. They leave while promising to return. The girl introduces herself as Kid. She takes an interest in Serge's predicament, having overheard the knights refer to him as a ghost, and invites him to come with her while she does whatever it is that she's doing. Whether you agree or not, you'll meet again in the nearby town of Termina, where we learn of more inconsistencies. From Serge's memory, the main continent of El Nido is under control of the nation of Por. Yeah, Por, remember them from Trigger? Apparently, they've become quite the conquerors over the years, taking control of not only El Nido, but the kingdom of Guardia as well. Termina is the capital of El Nido and was protected by an elite army of knights known as the Acacia Dragoons until 3 years ago, when General Viper, the leader of Dragoons, disappeared along with the entire army without so much as a trace, allowing the Por military to come in with ease. But now none of that seems to have happened. According to the locals, Termina is still under the protection and care of General Viper and the Dragoons, and Serge is the only one who seems to remember things differently. As for Kid, she's looking to obtain the legendary Frozen Flame, some sort of artifact that can apparently endow whoever possesses it with great power, or at least grant them their greatest wish. Kid's only lead to the flame is Viper Manor, and seeing as how the Dragoons were ordered to bring Serge into custody, she suggests that there might be some clues to his identity there as well, and invites him along. The team invades the manor and searches for clues. A representative from the Por army is apparently here conducting negotiations with Viper. After speaking with some Dragoons, the team learns that it was the representative who ordered the capture of Serge for reasons yet to be determined. The team meets Karsh, Zoa, and Marshy, the top elite members of the Dragoon army, the Acacia Devas. The team also meets an old man who refers to himself as a prophet of time. He suggests that Serge is actually from an alternate reality completely parallel to this timeline but with different results. He admits that he doesn't know what drew Serge into this reality or what caused the split in the first place, but the idea is that time was flowing normally for eons until 10 years ago when Serge's life was thrown into the air like a coin toss with a 50-50 chance of life or death. The timeline then split in two, with Serge surviving in one timeline and dying in the other. The team continues on and meets a strange girl dressed as a circus clown named, unoriginally enough, Harley. She flirtatiously teases Serge and warns him to stay away from Kid. Continuing on, the team sneaks into Viper's office where they find a strange glowing orb on the desk. Viper then enters the room accompanied by the Por representative, whose face resembles that of a panther and whom Kid recognizes and refers to as Lynx. Lynx takes little interest in her and speaks directly to Serge, telling him that the frozen flame lies deep in the Sea of Eden. Viper's daughter Riddell then casually enters the room, not expecting this reception, and Kid seizes her and puts a knife to her throat, warning Viper to let them leave. Viper's Dragoons then surround the team, but dare not aggress them as Riddell's life is on the line. Kid makes her way up to a balcony where Lynx throws a knife at her arm, causing her to lose her hold on Riddell and fall off of the balcony. Lynx then tells Serge that he knows who he is and has been waiting for him. He refers to Serge as the assassin of time, the Chrono Trigger. Serge, having no other options, jumps off of the balcony after Kid and lands in the water where a young boy with a boat finds them and takes him into his home in the small island village of Guldove. The next morning, Kid collapses from her injury and is taken to Guldove's doctor for treatment. At this point, the details of the story play out differently depending on your actions. The doctor, lacking the necessary medicine, gives Kid a grim prognosis. You now have a choice. Leave Kid's health in the doctor's unsure hands or try and save her yourself. Either way, Kid pulls through and eventually rejoins your party, and the team discovers that Serge has the ability to travel between the two timelines by using an amulet belonging to Kid in conjunction with a temporal distortion at the beach where this whole thing started. For the sake of clarity, I will refer to Serge's timeline as Homeworld and the other time as Another World, as those are the names that appear on the world map from here on. Whatever caused the time split seems to be directly related to Serge. The team learns from Guldovian locals that an ancient artifact known as the Dragon Tear was recently stolen from the sacred shrine. The inhabitants of Guldove are a deeply religious people who worship 6 elemental deities depicted as dragons. Much of their religion is rooted from a now extinct culture known as the Dragonians. Serge and friends also learn from the locals of Termina that the Por army is preparing an invasion, and General Viper and his troops are headed towards a ruined Dragonian compound known as Fort Dragonia. A retired Dragoon named Radius believes that the general seeks to obtain the frozen flame as a means of defense against Por, and that Lynx has his own agenda. Believing that the strange glowing orb on Viper's desk was the Dragon Tear, the team sets off in pursuit of Viper and Lynx, occasionally butting heads with Harley, who is apparently working for Lynx. If you have Kid in your party at the right times, you can learn some of her backstory. She has no memory of her mother and father, no clue to her identity. As far as she knows, she was abandoned or orphaned at birth. When she was a baby, she was found and taken in by a young woman who raised her as a sister. The girl eventually brought in other orphan children as well. Kid recalls that they didn't have a lot, but were very happy, until one day when Lynx came in, kidnapped the girl, and set fire to the house, burning it to the ground. Kid, a very small child at the time, barely escaped with her life, and never saw her friends or the girl again. Over the years, she went the way of the bandit and even joined the Radical Dreamers, a band of thieves from the poor mainland. Her goal is to find the frozen flame with which she hopes to bring her adoptive sister back, and now that she knows Lynx is an element in this adventure, she hopes to kill him in vengeance. Although it's not directly stated now, the girl who took her in was actually Luca Ashtier from Chrono Trigger. I know I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but the game doesn't do the best job in revealing that fact to you. Anyway, the team continues on to Fort Dragonia, but not before facing off against Karsh, Marcy, and Zoa. The team reaches Fort Dragonia, which you should recognize as the place in Serge's dream sequence. Deep in the fort, the team goes head-to-head with General Viper. Lynx then stabs him in the back, and I mean that in the most literal sense of the term, telling him that he did his part and is no longer needed. After battling it out with Serge and friends, Lynx, in a surprising move, uses the Dragon Tear to switch bodies with Serge. With Serge's body, he stabs Kid in the gut while the real Serge, trapped in the body of Lynx, which has now been weakened from the whooping we gave him, watches in horror. Lynx then sends Serge through some sort of distortion portal while the Dragon Tear shatters. Serge, still in the body of Lynx, finds himself in a strange dimensional vortex. He is completely alone save for a 200-something-year-old goblin lady named Sprig, who has apparently been living here for quite some time. The two attempt to make their way through the distortion. Along the way they meet Harley, who I must say has been quite the oddball throughout this whole adventure. At first I passed her off as Lynx's top lackey, who seems to get an erotic pleasure from messing with Serge and friends. You even fight her before meeting Radius. Then before entering Fort Dragonia, she appears again. Her tone is completely different this time. She warns Serge about what could happen to him if he continues on, and genuinely seems concerned for his safety. What's her deal? And now at this point, she joins your party, saying that she still needs you for something and can't afford to have you die just yet. She also apparently doesn't seem to care about the real Lynx anymore. Something's up with her. Anyway, the team manages to exit the dimensional vortex and arrives in home world. Serge finds himself unable to return to another world at this point. Harley explains that he is technically no longer Serge, but in fact Lynx, and the distortion doesn't respond to him. She also suggests that he can regain his original body through the Dragon Tear. Serge returns to his home village of Arnie, where, just like in another world, he is unrecognized, not because he died 10 years ago, but rather because he's in the wrong body. Well, to be more accurate, some people here do recognize him as Lynx, and they don't give him the warmest welcome. There are only two people who bother to hear him out. The first is his mom, who seems very interested in the fact that Lynx mentioned the Sea of Eden. She recalls that many years ago, her husband, Wazuki, his best friend Miguel, Lena's father, and a very young Serge accidentally ended up at the Sea of Eden. Apparently, when Serge was little, he was attacked by a wild panther. Wazuki and Miguel took him first to Termina for medical treatment, and then Goldove, neither of which could help him, so they set sail for Marbul, an island populated only by demi-humans. On the way over, the group was caught in a terrible thunderstorm that steered the boat completely off course and into the Sea of Eden. Wazuki and Serge returned, Serge being fully healed, but Miguel was never seen again. According to Serge's mom, Wazuki was a different man from that day on. The other person who hears him out is Radius, who in this timeline is the village elder of Arnie. He joins our team and takes us to Termina, which, as you may recall, is run by the poor military in this timeline. The commander of the army, a guy by the name of Norris, informs us that 3 years ago, Lynx came to Termina, tickled Viper's ear with whispers of the frozen flame, a possible weapon that could give the Dragoons power, and Viper took his whole army to the Sea of Eden, or the Dead Sea as it is referred to in this timeline, to recover it. Viper and his men never returned, however, so the poor army had no trouble coming in and taking over. The team eventually made their way into the Dead Sea, which appears to house some sort of ruined city. The thing is, the broken down technology here seems incredibly advanced, almost as if it came from the future. In fact, this whole area looks like it was ripped straight out of the post-apocalyptic future of Chrono Trigger, and we know that's impossible, seeing as how the last thing we did in that game was change history so that the apocalypse didn't happen. Impossible or not, the team discovers one lone computer console that has barely enough power to confirm that Lavos did in fact nuke the Earth in 1999 AD. Of course, Serge and friends, being completely disconnected from that game, have absolutely no idea what Lavos even is. Serge also notices ghostly figures resembling Chrono, Marl, and Luca. Continuing on, the team locates General Viper, his daughter Riddell, and the entire Dragoon army, all of which have been completely frozen in time. A little further in, the team arrives at the ruins of Nadia's Bell in Lean Square. A man greets them and introduces himself as Lena's father, Miguel. He confirms having come to this place years ago with Wazuki and a wounded Serge, although he says the place looked a lot different at the time. He explains that this whole area represents a future that never happened, a would-be history that was changed thanks to the efforts of Chrono and friends from the previous game. I feel the need to point out that up to this point, various people in the game have been talking about things like destiny and fate. I guess it was fate for this to happen, or it's my fate for that to happen, and so forth. Miguel talks a lot about fate, but in a different way. He talks about fate like it's some sort of entity or deity. Until now, the only others to talk about fate like that have been a group of dwarves who reference the goddess of fate. The team stands before Miguel in battle, as defeating him will realign the time distortion so that it will respond to Lynx's body. for some reason. The surrounding area begins to collapse around them. Miguel explains that fate itself is destroying everything here, including the frozen flame, so as not to let it fall into the wrong hands. Miguel also refers to Serge as the one whom the flame has chosen. The team narrowly escapes the self-implosion with the assistance of one of the 6 dragon gods, the Sky Dragon. Upon returning to the distortion point, Serge finds that he is able once more to use the amulet to travel between worlds. Things are quite astir in another world. Lynx has apparently been running around in our body, causing an uprising. The poor military has taken over Viper Manor and Termina, and all of Serge's friends want nothing to do with us. Serge meets up with Karsh and Zoa, who bring him up to speed. After Serge was thrown into the dimensional vortex and Lynx escaped, Karsh and Zoa took a wounded Viper to Radius's hideout, while Marcy gathered up the broken pieces of the Dragon Tear. Karsh gives the pieces to Serge, which have now molded together to form the Tear of Hate. The Davis team up with Serge to storm Viper Manor and rescue Miss Riddell, who is currently being held captive by poor soldiers. Along the way, the team recruits the help of a pirate captain named Fargo, with whom we have had dealings earlier in the game. The team meets up with Radius's place, while this world's Commander Norris heads back to the Zanin mainland to try to convince the poor officials to withdraw from El Nido. Back at Radius's, Viper has made an encouraging recovery under the care of Marcy. Soon after Serge and Co arrive, the place is attacked by Lynx, now in the body of Serge, and Kid, who has apparently survived her knife wound. Serge and Co attempt to reason with Kid, but she is under the impression that Serge is really Lynx and is determined to kill him. Serge and Co are rescued by Captain Fargo's giant parrot and taken to his ship, the SS Invincible. The team set sail for the Sea of Eden, but upon their arrival, Harley informs them that until Serge can reclaim his original body, they won't be able to reach the frozen flame. With no other options, the team decides to return the Tear of Hate to Guldove. At this point, Harley quietly leaves the team, clearly troubled by something, burdened by some sort of responsibility. The village elder of Guldove, an old woman named Iree, and her young shrine maiden Stina, inform Serge that the Tear no longer possesses the power needed to return him to his own body. Iree suggests that there may still be a dragon Tear in Homeworld. She then gives us a dragon emblem and tells us to show it to her counterpart in Homeworld. Serge shows the emblem to Guldove's village leader, who in Homeworld is actually Stina. Since Diree is nowhere to be seen, and considering how old she looked, I'm guessing that she's no longer alive in this timeline. Anyway, Stina invokes the tired, overused video game trope and says that she cannot simply give us the Dragon Tear. We must first prove ourselves worthy by obtaining the blessings of the 6 dragon gods. The dragons are located across both worlds. It's actually possible, and quite probable, to have already seen up to 4 of them at this point. Serge fights and defeats each dragon in battle, each time receiving their respective relic. Once Serge holds all 6 relics, he shows these to Stina, who not only gives us the tear but joins our party as well. Serge takes the tear to Homeworld's Fort Trigonia, however Lynx is there waiting for us. The team hands him a beatdown and he escapes. Serge then takes the tear back into the fort where it eventually shatters just like the other tear, but not before giving Serge his 17-year-old human body back. At this point, the remains of the tear mold together to form the Tear of Love. Stina suggests that both of these tears could be used to summon a legendary element known as the Chrono Cross. Serge continues his journey with his friends from before who are now willing to help him, and the team enters the Sea of Eden in another world. In this timeline, it looks quite a bit different. Serge and friends enter a massive high-tech facility known as Chronopolis, a research center dedicated to the study of the space-time continuum. At this point, the game gives you a load of backstory and plot, but it's a little hard to follow because of its delivery. There are these strange ghostly apparitions who tell you different things, but I'm not entirely sure what they are. I think they represent the staff members of Chronopolis, but I don't know if they're ghosts or phantoms or what. I'm just going to think of them as temporal after images. That being said, here's the lowdown. This research center is actually from the distant future. It was founded by a man named Balthazar, a name we should recognize from Chrono Trigger. As you may or may not remember from that game, Balthazar was one of 3 sages from the ancient kingdom of Zeal in 12,000 BC. During an attempt to extract energy from Lavos from within the planet's core, Balthazar, the other sages, and the queen's son Giannis were all thrown into different points of time. Balthazar ended up in the year 2300 AD. When Chrono and his friends found him, he was trying to understand the space-time continuum, but wasn't even able to scratch the surface due to the fact that he was trapped in a post-apocalyptic future where mankind was on the verge of extinction and had little to no resources. However, thanks to Chrono and Co., that entire future was changed. Instead, Balthazar found himself in a time where humanity was thriving and technology was far more advanced than you could possibly imagine. Balthazar made use of the people and resources available to create the center, even drawing on archived data from Dr. Luca Ashtier, who apparently did her own studies on temporal mechanics. Fast forward about 100 years. The center has grown even more advanced. Its central computer system system, called Fate, has gathered vast amounts of data and is far more advanced than anything ever created before it. The scientists are not only studying alternate timelines, but the intricacies of human brain patterns as well. The researchers believe it is possible to rewrite the thought patterns and emotions of people, thereby controlling what they think and feel. Meanwhile, a temporal experiment goes terribly wrong and sends the entire center thousands of years into the distant past. The Fate computer system then terraforms the very collection of landmasses we know as the El Nido Archipelago, erases the memories of the humans working here, scatters them across the newly formed continent, and uses computer interface terminals called Records of Fate, our save points, to control the lives of the people. This means that not only are most of our human characters descendants of the research staff, with a few exceptions like Norris, who originated from the Xanan mainland, the lives of everyone on El Nido are controlled, quite literally, by Fate. Serge and co continue on and make their way into the central control room. A security console warns them that only the registered arbiter is allowed access to the room. The system then scans Serge's retina and handprints, accepts him as the current arbiter, and grants him access, much to our surprise and confusion. Inside the room is a massive capsule with conduits branching out all over the place, the central control core of the Fate computer system. Also in the room is Lynx, still rocking Serge's body, and an unconscious kid. Lynx tells us that he is a physical and organic manifestation of Fate itself, a living, breathing organism programmed by Fate. He also tells us that the core itself is powered by the frozen flame, which is none other than a piece of Lavos. As I mentioned earlier, Serge's father Wazuki and Lena's father Miguel came here years ago, quite by accident when a violent thunderstorm steered them off course while they were trying to take a wounded Serge to Marbul for medical treatment from his panther wound. As it turns out, the storm was so severe that it temporarily disabled Fate's security systems, allowing Wazuki to take Serge into the control room and bring him into contact with the flame. This had the effect of healing Serge's wounds, but at the same time, a rogue algorithm implanted into the system by Balthazar himself activated and locked everything down, allowing access only to Serge, whom it had now scanned and written into its databanks as Arbiter, thus explaining why Lynx needed Serge's body in the first place. Now fully in control of Fate, Lynx destroys the algorithm, appropriately named Prometheus, transforms into Fate's true form, and stands before Serge and friends. The team successfully destroys Fate, causing Lynx to die on the spot. At that moment, the 6 dragons, now realizing that Fate has fallen, leave their respective confines, converge on one spot, and fuse together to form one gargantuan dragon, while Sky Dragon Isle itself rises out of the sea, forming what a now awakened kid refers to as Terra Tower. She claims that the tower and the dragons are from some other timeline and were pulled into this one with Chronopolis and sealed away by Fate. She then says that they are now free to carry out their revenge. Harley then arrives and tells Serge that she wishes it didn't have to come to this. She has a brief struggle with Kid, whom she overpowers, then snatches the frozen flame out of the computer core and escapes. The team takes the once more unconscious Kid to Radius's, where the spirits of Masa, Mune, and Doreen from Chrono Trigger guide Serge back into time to the point when Luca's home was invaded by Lynx. Serge rescues Kid and the other children from the burning house, but is unable to retrieve Luca. Back in the present, Kid awakens, apparently having no memory of the events that took place right before the team entered Fort Dragonia for the first time. She tells Serge that this happens whenever she gets into a dangerous situation. She blacks out, wakes up somewhere else, and has no idea of how she got there. Alright then, if you say so. The team enters Terra Tower and makes their way past 6 elemental guardians. Along the way, they reunite with the old prophet from Viper Manor, who turns out to be Balthazar. Time for another backstory plot dump. Centuries from now, in 2400 AD, Chronopolis will attempt to open a portal into an alternate parallel timeline in which Lavos' arrival in 65 million BC caused the extinction of humans rather than dinosaurs. By 2400 AD of this timeline, the reptiles live in an advanced city called Dinopolis, which is protected by a gargantuan dragon guardian that they have constructed using the frozen flame. This experiment will go terribly wrong and Chronopolis will be hurled thousands of years into the past, while at the same time, Terra Tower, a section of Dinopolis, will be drawn into this dimension and also be hurled thousands of years into the past, to the same point in time as Chronopolis is hurled. The two civilizations then wage war against each other. Humans versus reptiles, Chronopolis versus Dinopolis, Fate versus Dragon Guardian. Ultimately, Fate prevails, splitting the Dragon Guardian into 6 smaller entities and seals them away in the newly formed El Nido Archipelago. For thousands of years, Fate watched over El Nido and kept the dragon sealed away, with the remaining reptiles eventually going extinct and being remembered as the Dragonians. Then comes the day of the thunderstorm that steered Wazuki and Miguel into the Sea of Eden. As mentioned earlier, the storm temporarily knocked out Fate's security system. Realizing that Fate's hold over them was temporarily loosened, the 6 dragons created in secret a 7th Dragon Guardian, commissioned with the task of permanently breaking Fate's hold over them. This 7th dragon is actually Harley. Her entire reason for teaming up with Lynx and then eventually Serge was to reach the frozen flame and break the seal. And thanks to the fact that Serge and his friends just destroyed Fate, the dragons are now free to wipe out humanity. Whoops. What's more, Balthazar foresaw all of this in the future while he was studying the space-time continuum. That's when he planted the Prometheus algorithm into Fate, and then traveled into our time to meet Serge, the new Arbiter. At the top of the tower lies the frozen flame itself. The team then stands before the Dragon Guardian. After they had defeated it, Balthazar tells him that the dragon was merely an extension of a more sinister creature, the Devourer of Time, which lies in a dimensional void beyond space and time. He gives Serge a time egg and tells him to go to the place where it all started, where it will supposedly open a portal into the dimensional void where we can defeat the Devourer of Time once and for all and release the human soul that is apparently trapped inside it. Serge then returns to the beach where all of his trouble started. The spirits of Chrono, Marl, and Luca are here for one last bit of plot dumping. Let's go back in time to the events of Chrono Trigger. As you may or may not remember, Lavos was prematurely awakened in 12,000 BC when the magical kingdom of Zeal attempted to extract its energy. The entire kingdom was wiped out. Chrono's friends were very nearly wiped out as well, but were saved by Queen Zeal's daughter, Shala, who used the last of her magic to send them to safety. With no magic left to save her, Shala was pulled into the dimensional void. After Chrono and friends defeated Lavos, its soul ended up in the same place. Shala was then consumed by Lavos' anger and hatred, and the two fused together to form the Devourer of Time. Not only was this abomination the controller of the Dragon Guardian, it was also the controller of Fate, as the two were powered by the frozen flame, a literal piece of Lavos. Then comes the day of little Serge's panther attack. As Wazuki and Miguel try to rush him to Marbul, his cries of pain and fear reach the ears of Shala thanks to the power of video game magic and temporarily awakens her humanity. In this moment, she does two things. First, to preserve her humanity, she creates a baby clone of her human self, which she sends to another point in time. This baby is then picked up and raised by Luca and grows into the girl we know as Kid. The second thing that Shala does is cause the very storm that steers Wazuki and Miguel into the Sea of Eden. Shala, quite literally the goddess of fate, guides Wazuki to the flame through which she reaches out and heals Serge. However, fate begins to rewrite itself onto Wazuki's brain, eventually transforming him into Lynx, giving him the face of Serge's greatest fear at the time, a panther. Believing that killing the current Arbiter will correct the lockdown problem caused by the Prometheus algorithm, Lynx drowns Serge at the beach. This does not have the desired result, however, and the flame remains inaccessible to Lynx. It's around this time that he meets Harley, and the two study the space-time continuum for answers, even kidnapping Luca to see if she knows anything. Many years later, an adult Kid is approached by Balthazar, who sends her back in time to prevent Serge's death, whom he believes to be the key to freeing Shala. Kid is successful in saving Serge, however, this causes the timeline to split into two separate and parallel dimensions, one where Serge lives and the other where he dies. Once Lynx realizes that there is another timeline with Serge still alive in it, he does everything he can to bring him and the Dragon Tear to Fort Trigonia so that he can switch bodies with him and reach the flame. With nothing else left to do, Serge and his friends use the time egg to enter the dimensional void and defeat the Devourer of Time. Now, there are two ways you can go about doing this. One is to wail on the thing and defeat it just like you would any other boss. If you do this, the entire creature, Shala's body included, is sucked into nothingness. Then the game just sort of ends. Not good. The other method is to use the Chrono Cross, which you can create from the Tears of Love and Hate after the defeat of Fate. I'll talk a bit more about how to use the Chrono Cross against the Devourer later. Suffice to say that when you successfully pull it off, the creature dissolves into nothingness, but Shala remains and awakens. She then gives a long-winded speech about the lives of humans and how they affect the universe and so on, and then tells Serge that he will return to the point in time where this whole adventure started, but will remember none of it. She promises to come and find him, even though the two will not recognize each other, but she will find him. Then the game ends properly. Just like Trigger, New Game Plus becomes available after you've beaten it at least once. In this mode, Serge starts the game with the time egg in his pocket, allowing you to face the final boss literally at any point you want. Doing so shows different endings, all of which are fun little what-if scenarios, but not actually true. Okay, let's talk about some of the pros and cons about this story and why some people don't like it to the point that it breaks the game for them. First off, our cast of characters is a whole whopping 44. That's right, you heard me correctly, 44 playable characters. Look up the definition of the word excessive, and it should point to this game's character roster. Now don't freak out, you don't have to recruit everybody. Less than half of these characters are mandatory and less than half of them are useful. Many of them are interesting though. There's certainly a lot of variety. Characters come in all ages, some older than dirt to some having just been born. There's humans, animals, and everything in between. You can even recruit a space alien. Some of my favorites include Van, a young boy who lives with his father Go in Termina. In another world, his dad is a rich snobby businessman who doesn't approve of his passion for painting. In Homeworld, Go is a starving painter with Van being more economically inclined. I also like Draggy because he's a baby dragon, Glenn because he's a powerhouse, and Riddell because she's just so angelic. Not all of these characters are important to the main story. The most pivotal would be Serge, Kid, and Harley, who is a temporary character. Although Serge is a silent protagonist, he is by no means a clone of Chrono. In his own game, Chrono was little more than a means to travel to the next area. He was a taxi driver. You tell him where to go and he takes you there. His friends decided where to go next and what to do, and if you remove Chrono from the game, things really wouldn't turn out a whole lot differently, save for a few specific instances. Serge still comes across as a taxi driver with no free will of his own, but he's far more pivotal to the story. He's basically the central catalyst of everything. Without him, there'd be no Lynx, no Kid, no Harley, Shala would spend eternity as part of the Time Devourer, and Fate would still be controlling El Nido. Kid is the clone of Shala. She's maybe not quite as pivotal as Serge, but she still contributes a lot to the big picture. The only thing I don't like about her is the whole I black out when I'm in danger and can't remember a thing. The explanation is that her amulet has a magic spell from Shala that rewinds her out of danger at the moment of her death to an earlier point in time, but that just comes across as lazy to me. Plus, Serge was holding the amulet when she was stabbed by Lynx. Whatever. Harley is pretty interesting. She's one of the dragons created for the sole purpose of removing Fate's hold on the other dragons. But what she doesn't count on is falling in love with Serge, causing a conflict of interest between what she wants to do and what she is supposed to do. This makes her easier to sympathize with. Lynx is as close to a standard JRPG villain as we're gonna get. The power is the frozen flame. He wants that power, and to get it, he has to orchestrate an elaborate turn of events and steal Serge's body. He fits the bill at first, but as it turns out, he really doesn't have any ambition. He's doing all of this because he's programmed by Fate to do so. The thing I don't understand is why he wastes so much time in actually getting to the flame. Like, it makes sense for him to negotiate with Viper and catch the attention of Serge and lure them to the fort with the tear at the ready because he needs Serge's body to get to the flame, but once he has said body, he just starts running around in another world causing an uprising. And then he tries to stop us in Homeworld. Dude, just get to the flame already. And the fact that he used to be Serge's father Wazuki isn't bad by any means, but it doesn't really do anything in the long run. There's drawing inspiration from a pre-existing story because one of the plot devices is interesting and it might just be what your story needs, and then there's just ripping off Star Wars for the sake of ripping off Star Wars. Back to the characters, if you do choose to get every single character, just know that it's not possible to recruit more than 39 of them unless you're playing New Game Plus. Still, it's very easy to recruit people. If you're walking down the street and sneeze as you pass a complete stranger, chances are they're going to join your team. One thing I hear people complain about is that none of our friends from Trigger are in this game, aside from occasionally appearing as ghosts. Many people assume that they've died between that game and this game. Luca even tells Kid at the end that they no longer exist in this world. I see why this is a problem for some players, finding out that the characters you invested in the last game are dead, but I choose not to let this bother me. Do you know why? Guess who's dead when you start a new file in Chrono Trigger and the game opens up in 1000 AD? Ayla, Magus, and Frog. That's who. And at the end, when they go back to their own times, that technically means they're dead by our calendars, except for Robo, who hasn't even been created yet. These guys aren't immortal, so why should Chrono, Luca, and Marl be? I don't know, that's just me. Now, the most definitive aspect about Chrono Trigger's storyline is that it revolves around time travel. Now, this creates a bit of an interesting situation for the sequel. On one hand, making this story about time travel might overuse and wear out what made Trigger so special. On the other hand, not having any sort of temporal gimmick whatsoever is like sidelining the main thing about Trigger. So you want something sort of like time travel, but not quite the same, and I think the alternate parallel dimension thing works quite well. It's certainly not an original concept. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and they dabbled a lot in alternate realities, almost as much as they did with time travel. Now, of course, thanks to the MCU, I can sum the whole thing up in one word: multiverse. But for those of you who are pretty familiar with Star Trek, I wouldn't exactly compare this game's story to the Mirror Universe. I'd say it's more like the Next Generation episode Parallels, where Lieutenant Worf finds himself shifting through quantum realities, each one being made up of results from decisions that were not made in the one reality he perceives as his own. That's basically what we get here. When you make a decision in one timeline, a sequence of events unfolds based off of that, leaving you only to wonder what might have happened if you had made a different decision, while your counterpart in the other timeline makes that other decision, causing events to unfold with regard to that. Take this guy in Arnie Village, for example. He's a fisherman in Homeworld, has been for many years. He had his own aspirations and thought about doing other things, but ultimately decided to follow in his father's footsteps. In another world, he does follow his aspirations, which lead him down a dark path. It's also fun to take one of your party members and have them meet their counterpart from the other world. This game's abstract theme is the concept of opposites, not just with the two realities, but also with things like elemental forces: white and black, blue and red, yellow and green. The obvious moral message here is that humans need to learn how to get along with each other and stop hurting each other all the time. Not necessarily a bad message, but given how constantly they throw this in your face, it does come off as a bit preachy. Now, when it comes to the amount of plot twist that I look for in any story, this game is everything I want and more. I love the blend of sci-fi and fantasy, where you have people talking about fate like it's some sort of deity, and it turns out to be a massive supercomputer. Or how Serge is supposedly the chosen one, and it's all because fate accidentally scanned him as the arbiter. There are a few things to complain about, though. What difference does it make whether fate works the way it was supposed to, or only responds to Serge, or is destroyed? Because because it doesn't seem like anything really changes. Before Serge came along, Fate was, I guess, controlling everything and everyone, but it seems like that was still going on after he came into contact with the Flame. Like in Arnie Village, you can find people using records of Fate to get their daily algorithms written onto them, and this continues even after you defeated Fate. So what actually changed? Another thing that kind of bothers me is how trusting everybody is. So you wake up in an alternate reality in which you no longer exists, and anytime you tell this to somebody else, they're totally cool with believing you. Like,
what? Are you serious? That's crazy. An alternate reality. Man. This is a first time for everything, am I right?
I especially like Cheap Diary from Galdo, where it's all like,
there's something strange about you. I can't quite put my finger on it. It's like you're not quite... It's like you don't quite exist. That probably makes no sense. Yeah, about that. I'm actually from an alternate reality. Oh, well that explains it. I honestly don't know why I didn't guess that sooner.
But the moment you get your body switched with Lynx, the residents of Arnie think you're lying. I mean, it's great that they finally learned to be skeptical and not take everything at face value, but it certainly is inconsistent with the way everyone else has been acting, and once you leave the village, people start believing your wild story again. I especially love it when you meet Norris and it's all like,
you know, there's something odd about you. It's almost like you're not Sir Lynx. Does that make any sense? Well, you see, the thing is, I'm not actually Lynx. I'm this kid named Serge. I got my body switched up. You see what I mean? Oh, well, my bad. I should have guessed it. That would definitely explain why you don't seem like Sir Lynx.
The main thing I hear people complain about when discussing this story is the execution and delivery, and I'm forced to agree. This plot has a lot going on in it. Serge finds himself able to move back and forth through two different dimensions, Kid has a personal vendetta against Lynx, the poor army is preparing to invade Termina, and this guy turns into a mushroom. These are all what I consider to be local problems, things that exist only for the story of this game. The thing is, when I first played this game, I didn't much care about all of this. Okay, Lynx is the bad guy, Kid needs treatment for a poisonous knife wound, Poor's coming. This is not what I'm here for. My eyes and ears were tuned to anything that was about Chrono Trigger, and this game has a really nasty habit of boring me with local problems after local problems and teasing me with the smallest glimpse of the big picture and then throwing more local problems at me. When we first meet Lynx, he calls us the Assassin of Time, the Chrono Trigger. That's very interesting. I'd like to know more about that. But then our next immediate concern is Kid's injury and what we can do about that. Then the threat of a poor invasion starts looming over Termina like an ominous shadow, and we have pirates to deal with, and it isn't until we get to Fort Dragonia where Luca's name even gets dropped. But then almost immediately we're faced with the reality of being trapped in Lynx's body, and we spend the next several hours trying to remedy that little predicament. Then there's the Dead Sea, which looks like Chrono Trigger's 2300 AD, and the computer console that drops the name of Lavos. And then immediately shuts down and the game's just like, move along. When we meet Miguel, he does basically tell us everything we need to know, but he does so in a very obscure metaphorical way that doesn't really make any sense to you unless you've already played through the game and know what happens. We really don't get any answers until we go to Chronopolis, and then, oh man, the game just takes all of the plot that it really should have been evenly feeding us throughout this whole adventure and just dumps it on us. It's a lot to take in and process. And then they do it again at the top of Terra Tower, and then again at the beach right before the final boss. Guys! Remember in my review of Final Fantasy VII when I said that game's basic plot and story weren't too special, but it was the way the story was told that made it so good, and that a story is ultimately only as good as its delivery? The same rule applies here now on the opposite side of the spectrum. This plot is amazing. I love it so much. It has the potential to make this my favorite game of all time, but the way it's told is messy and chaotic and brings the whole thing down to a level much lower than it could have been. Now, despite the story being messy and chaotic, it somehow still manages to compel me to want to play through the game again and again. Part of this is because there are a few select moments where you're forced to make one decision over another, each giving you different results, and if you want to see what happens if you make the other choice, you'll have to play through the game again and choose differently that time. Another reason is that there are a lot of little nuggets here and there that contribute to the big picture in ways you won't realize until your second or third playthrough. You'll never hear me say that Chrono Cross doesn't have replay value, and there are still some really powerful, incredible moments in this story. One of my favorites is when the famous singer Nikki sings a magical song of the demi-humans to save their home village of Marbul. I also think it's interesting that Glenn's big brother and Riddell's fiancé, Dario, died in another world, but in Homeworld he's the only Dragoon still alive as the rest were lost in the Dead Sea. I also like that if you choose not to spend time looking for treatment for Kid's injury, by the time you return to Homeworld, a group of hunters have killed the last Hydra in Hydra Marshes, driving out the indigenous dwarves who now believe the forest to be uninhabitable. Now in need of a new place to live, they travel to Water Dragon Isle and forcefully conquer the fairies that live here. The fairies naturally blame the humans for giving the dwarves the idea, and you think, "Aw, that's sad." But if you do choose to help Kid, you end up being the one who kills the last Hydra, you drive the dwarves out, and when they take over the fairies' home, the burden of guilt weighs much heavier on you. Even though the rest of the plot may be kinda messy, this is good storytelling. Perhaps the most unforgivable aspect is the fact that Serge forgets this entire adventure at the end. You have no idea how hard I roll my eyes when stories of any kind do this. To me, a story is not about what happens at the end, but what happens between the beginning and the end. I mean, if I pick up a book, I don't skip to the very last page. During this whole adventure, Serge learns new things, meets people, forges friendships, and makes memories, be those good or bad. If we're to consider him a real person with his own mind and consciousness, then he should be walking and talking just a bit differently at the end, as everything he's experienced has molded him a certain way. It's given him a new perspective. It's changed the way he thinks about some things. But if he doesn't remember any of it, then none of it really matters. And it's just such a cheap, lazy trope that's been overused at this point. Now, just to be clear, things will turn out differently for life on El Nido now that Fate's been destroyed, so at least we know that our efforts made a difference, be it good or bad, but still, not cool. Meanwhile, I can't help wondering what exactly happens to Shala at the end of all this. Does she die? Does she go back to her own time of 12,000 BC with new knowledge and insight and become a leader humanity needs during that time? Does she return to Serge's time and wander aimlessly through a foreign era? Does she evolve into some celestial entity that transcends time and space? I think most people assume that her consciousness joins with Kid's, and by optimism, she eventually reunites with Serge. But at the end of the day, we don't know. It's just not very clear. And on that note, I'm done talking about story. I know that was long-winded, and I'm sorry. Let's talk about gameplay. Like most RPGs of the day, there are places to explore, treasures to collect, and enemies to fight. Like Trigger, you can have up to 3 party members at a time, and they tag along after you wherever you go. By default, you walk at slow speed with the D-pad and run with the circle button, but you can change that around in the config menu. You can switch party members around with a device called the teleporter at save points or on the world map. The entire game takes place in the El Nido archipelago, which presumably exists somewhere in the world of Trigger, but you are confined to this area at all times. By the end of the game, you'll be able to travel anywhere within the El Nido region, but you can never leave El Nido. Content-wise, it's about half the size of a normal RPG, and given that you have to go through each individual area twice, once in each dimension to collect all of the treasure, I'd say it makes for a standard-sized world. My only complaint with the parallel dimensions thing is that the beach is the only place where you can switch between the two, so anytime you're in one world and need to go to the other, you have to come back to this one point. A huge technical complaint I have is the ridiculously small hitboxes on interactable objects. It doesn't seem to be a huge problem with treasure chests, but man is it a pain when you're trying to open a door and it feels like you have to be perfectly lined up with the exact center of the doorknob. I know it sounds nitpicky, but it's a problem I consistently notice whenever I play this game. As you recruit more and more characters throughout your journey, you'll quickly notice the many different accents they come with. Scottish, English, French, Spanish, Russian, even pirate. This is thanks to an accent algorithm that was written for this game's dialogue. With 44 characters and a number of party combinations that I don't even want to try to guesstimate, the devs knew that the dialogue would get boring real quick. The way the algorithm works is you have a basic text dialogue written for different situations, like, Serge, why don't you try blowing the flute here? And then the algorithm takes whichever character is in the party and applies the accent to it, rather than writing separate lines of dialogue for each individual character and their respective accents. For some people, it's not even so much a question of accent. Like in the cases of Guiel, Glenn, Riddell, or Norris, it's just a refrain from contractions to make it sound more elegant, like, Serge, why do you not try blowing the flute here? Or in the case of Marcy, adding the word like all over the place because she's a little girl, or Zoa's text being in all caps, signifying that he has a loud, booming voice. I especially like how some characters have a special name for Serge or whatever you name your main character. Poshel calls him Sergipoo, Rasley calls him Sergi, Pip says Sergikins, Irina says Air Serge, and so on and so forth. Most of the peeps just stick with plain simple Serge, which I think is nice, and there's not too many folks out there that have nicknames for him so it becomes more of an annoyance, but there's enough to add a little life to it. Also, you can change the text window from a number of customizable frames you can acquire. Personally, I always stick with the default, but there's a butt ton of frames that be collected throughout the adventure. For equipment, every character has a weapon, a piece of armor, and can wear up to 3 accessories. Weapons and armor are handled a bit differently than prior RPGs. You have to pay a blacksmith to forge them, but you have to provide the materials yourself, similar to Final Fantasy VIII. Materials are either found in treasure chests or dropped from enemies. enemies. You'll need common raw materials like furs, seeds, screws, and the likes, as well as the base material itself, which determines the efficiency of the weapon: bone, copper, iron, mithril, stone, and the rare rainbow shells. There are smiths all around the world, but most of them only deal in low-quality material like bone and copper, with Karsh's father Zappa and Termina being the only good one who specializes in the latest and greatest, although he won't offer to forge advanced equipment until you progress far enough in the game so as not to let you get too powerful too early on. Halfway through the game, you'll receive the Smith's Spirit, which allows you to forge equipment at a save point or on the world map. Okay, let's talk about the battle mechanics. So like Chrono Trigger, there are no random battles, and instead the enemies are perfectly visible on screen, giving you the option to go around them or face them head on. There are also no battles on the map. Trigger's battle system was very much like Final Fantasy. This game's battle system is radically different. First off, no active time bar here. The battles are kinda sorta not really turn-based. Every character begins with a default number of 7 stamina points, and each time you attack, it uses up some stamina. Once you run out, that character can do nothing but wait for it to build back up. For physical attacks, each character can continually hack at the enemy until their stamina runs out, or the enemy straight up interrupts their turn, which happens a lot. Each character has 3 physical attack types: a weak attack, which does a weak amount of damage and uses up 1 stamina point, a strong attack, which does a moderate amount of damage and uses up 2 stamina points, and a fierce attack, which does a high amount of damage and uses up 3 stamina points. So with 3 attack options across 7 stamina points, you have a few different combos at your disposal. However, a huge factor to consider here is hit percentage. At the beginning of a single character's turn, their hit percentage is pretty low, somewhere in the high 80s for a weak attack, 70s for a strong, and 60s for a fierce. So it's a lot less likely to successfully land a fierce attack than a weak. At first. As your hits connect with the enemies, your hit percentage begins to build up, making it easier to land those harder hits. Of course, low hit percentage doesn't mean you'll never land a hit, it just makes it a lot less likely. On the opposite side, your hit percentage maxes out at 99, so because it can technically never reach 100, there's always a chance you'll miss, even if it's not very likely. As your hits connect with the enemies, the stamina of your other characters will build back up, although their hit percentages will reset back to the default values. You can also defend to build up stamina, which does leave you open for an attack, or you can switch to other characters mid-turn. It is extremely annoying when you're building up hit percentage with one character and the enemy decides to interrupt your turn. If he attacks someone else, it's no big deal, but if he attacks that one character you were already using, their hit percentage goes back to the default low, even if the enemy misses you. Unlike most RPGs, you don't level up in the way that you might expect, or gain levels as we know it. Instead, we get little stat boosts at the end of battles for things like HP, attack power, physical and magical defense, magic power, and so forth. After enough battles, stat boosts stop coming in. What's happening is the game doesn't want you to get too powerful too quickly, which is odd, effectively making it hard for you to level grind. Once you defeat a boss, you'll get a bunch of stat boosts, and then you'll start getting them regularly from battles again, repeating the cycle. Now let's talk about magic, which is handled through the elements system. Elements are acquired from chests, bought at shops, or dropped from enemies. They're basically magic spells to be used once per battle. Each character has an elemental grid consisting of several different slots across several different tier levels on which you can equip elements. At the start of the game, your characters have only 3 tiers available, but after defeating boss battles, they'll get some more tiers added as well as a few more slots to their existing tiers, giving you more places to equip elements. Most characters get up to 7 tiers, however, the number of slots on each character is different, so everyone's grid layout looks a little different. Equip an element onto a slot, that character can use it in battle. There's no MP in this game. Using an element requires element power, which is built up in battle as your character lands physical attacks. A successful weak attack builds up the element power by 1, a strong by 2, and a fierce by 3. At the start of a battle, each character's element power is at 0. When it's at 1, they can use an element from one of their level 1 slots. When it's at 2, they can use one of their level 2 slots, or 2 of their level 1 slots, and so on. Note that using an element uses more stamina than a physical attack, and if you use more elements worth of stamina than you already had, your stamina bar will actually go below 0 and into the negatives, making it take that much longer to build back up. A single element can only be used once per battle, but you can have up to multiple elements of the same spell on your grid, allowing you to use it up to that many times. Elements also have innate level properties, with higher level elements being more powerful than lower level elements. Placing an element onto a slot that is a level higher than that particular element's innate level increases its power by a factor of 1. 2 slots higher increases it by 2. For instance, placing a level 2 element onto a level 3 slot increases its power by 1. Placing that same element onto a level 4 slot raises it by 2, and putting it lower, say onto a level 1 slot, decreases its power by that much. Elements are ultimately defined by color attributes. For every color is an opposite: white and black, green and yellow, blue and red. In terms of offense, each color has 2 main styles of magic. White uses light and meteors, black uses gravity and shadow, green uses plants and wind, yellow uses earth and thunder, blue uses water and ice, and red uses fire and lava. Each color has its own supportive attributes as well. White, green, and blue have some healing properties, red and yellow can buff your attack power and defense, and black can increase everyone's overall elemental damage or reduce it. Although normal elements recharge after battles, there are some elements called consumables that can only be used once, ever. These can be used both in and out of battle, while normal elements can only be used in battle. Such consumables come in different colors and have different purposes, such as healing or curing certain status ailments. At the end of a battle, if everyone's HP is not at the maximum, you will be asked if you would like to heal without using consumables, use them as needed, or don't heal at all. Personally, I don't know why you'd choose option number 3, but whatever. Healing without consumables uses up as many healing elements that are already equipped onto your party members to fully restore your HP. The only catch is your character has to have sufficient element power built up by the end of the battle, and it has to be an element that hasn't been used in that particular battle. Choosing to use consumables as needed does the same thing, but if it's not enough to fully restore your HP, it starts using consumables in your inventory. You may have noticed that 3-colored egg shape in the upper left corner of the battle screen. This is the field effect. It changes color based on the elements you use. Say you use a red element, the first slot turns red. Use another color next, say white, and the first slot turns white while the red gets bumped to the second slot. Use the third element, maybe a green, and the first slot turns green, the white moves to the second slot, and the red moves to the third. Use another element, and that initial red is removed. When you use an element that is the same color as at least one of the slots on the field effect, that element will be a bit more powerful, more so if 2 or 3 slots are of that same color. Characters and enemies also have their own innate elemental color attributes. This means that when they use elements of that color, they're a little more powerful, and if they use elements of the opposite color, they're a little less powerful. Also, elemental power is far more efficient when the target is of the opposite color. For instance, blue elements do more damage to red characters or enemies, but less to blue characters or enemies. These differences aren't necessarily big and game-breaking on their own, but given how many variables there are, you can stack them on top of each other for some pretty good results, like turning the field effect completely red and having a red character use a red element on a blue enemy, for example. Innate elemental colors also affect physical attacks as well. Glenn, for example, is green, so he deals and takes more damage to and from yellow enemies, but deals and takes less damage to and from green enemies. Characters can equip almost any element their grid level permits, regardless of color. However, there are some high-level elements that can only be equipped by someone of that particular color. I like how innate elemental colors can sometimes match an attribute of a particular character. There are a few cases like Lucia, Karsh, Norris, and Glenn where it feels like they just picked random color for that person. But Serge is the main protagonist, so of course he gets white, and Lynx, being the main antagonist for most of the game, is black. Draggy is a baby dragon, so of course he gets red. Skelly is undead, so he's black. Irenas is a mermaid, so she gets blue. Rasley comes from a forest, so she's green. Doc is a doctor, a healer. Stina is a holy shrine maiden, and Riddell is just so angelic looking, so they're all white. It doesn't mean much in the big scheme of things, but it adds a nice little touch. Characters also have techs, but don't get your hopes up, these are not handled like they were in Chrono Trigger. Most characters get up to 3 techs in the game. These are just character-specific elements. They're locked in place on the 3rd, 5th, and 7th element tiers and can't be moved around. Some of them are magic-based, some are physical. Some are used for support, some are offensive. Some are single-targeting, some are multi-targeting. It depends on your character and the tech. You won't have access to all of these at the start of the game, but as you defeat bosses and your grid continues to grow, you start to unlock these techs. While some characters like Serge unlock their final tech, their level 7 tech, after enough grid growth, many characters have to acquire their final tech, not unlike the final limit breaks of Final Fantasy VII. There are also a few select character combinations that give you access to dual techs. Serge and Glenn, for example, Kid and Mel, Nikki and Mickey, etc. Dual techs are usually a separate color outside of the 2 characters using it. I'm gonna be honest, dual techs are even more useless than they were in Trigger, given how situational they are. And lastly, this game has summon elements, which allow your characters to summon an entity in battle. They're handled like high-level elements that can only be equipped by someone of that color, and they have to be placed in a pretty high spot on the grid. And you won't be able to use the summon until you've turned the field effect completely that color. When you defeat a boss, you get what's called a new star level. Each time you use a summon, it consumes a star. So if you run out of stars, you'll need to rest up at an inn before you can use a summon again. Summons are typically more trouble than they're worth, honestly. And finally, let's talk about the Chrono Cross. First and foremost, it is completely optional. It's basically its own element. When you equip it on a party member, you'll hear a music note each time an element is used in battle, whether it be by you or an enemy. The notes change depending on the colors of the elements. To unlock the true ending of the game, you need to use the Chrono Cross on the Time Devourer after having used all of the other element colors in the following order: yellow, red, green, blue, black, and white. Or you could just wail on the thing for the incomplete ending. At the end of the day, the battle system is very complicated to explain, but very simplistic in execution, and it won't take you long to get the hang of it and figure out how to exploit it to your advantage. edge. While I do prefer the much more traditional battle system of Trigger, this is still a system I can get down with. I love this game's art style. The character models are surprisingly detailed and look very well proportioned, although I will say that Potia looks like strawberry shortcake threw up all over her. I also love the designs for the 6 dragons. The water dragon looks like a giant fish, the earth dragon a dinosaur, the green dragon looks like some overgrown bullfrog with wings, the red and black dragons look wicked and slick, and oh man do I love the white dragon with its 4 wings that are feathered like an eagle. I also appreciate that Harley's face looks identical to Kid's, clown makeup aside, considering they're both rooted from Shala. Now, one thing I don't like is Shala's look. Now, she does look identical to Kid, which makes sense, but she doesn't look anything like she did in Trigger. Here she is in Trigger. Now here she is in Cross. What am I supposed to make of this? That if you take her appearance in Trigger and update the graphics, she just turns into this? Balthazar at least looks identical to his appearance in Trigger. Actually, hold on a minute. Bring back that Trigger sprite of Shala. You know who this looks like in Cross? Riddell, that's who. Oh well. As for the rest of the graphics, they're simply beautiful. I think this game's appearance has aged really well for the PS1. There's just something so immersive and ambient about the textures and backgrounds. The only criticism I can think of is that the oversaturation of colors does tend to make things look a bit pukey in my opinion, but still, this game looks gorgeous. And the FMV cutscenes, oh man. Special shout out to the Panther. Amazing job with the fur. The music was composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, who, as you may well recall, was the composer for most of Trigger's soundtrack until he made himself sick from working so hard and had to be bailed out by Nobuo Uematsu. This soundtrack is amazing. I consider it one of the greatest on the PS1. Some tracks come from Chrono Trigger, like the world map music in Homeworld and the Victory fanfare, while others come from Radical Dreamers, like the world map music in Another World, the battle music, and Viper Manor. The music that plays during the opening cutscene is an absolute banger, the only problem being that it doesn't play much during the rest of the game. We also don't get too many character themes, which is understandable considering there's 44 playable characters. I like how some places like Arnie, Galdov, and Marbul have 2 different arrangements for their themes, one for each dimension. Actually, Marbul has a 3rd arrangement that plays in Nikki's concert, as it's the legendary magical song to restore the land. Termina for some reason doesn't get a unique arrangement for Homeworld, and instead shares a common area theme. In Another World, however, this place has one of the happiest and most alive tunes ever. I love it and could listen to it forever. So bright and cheery and almost Celtic. It's a shame that once Port takes over, you never hear it again, and instead it's replaced with another theme that almost sounds colonial, and is still really good. The Dragoons have a special theme of which there are 2 arrangements, one being very somber and beautiful, with the other sounding more like an epic battle cry. The Dragon Gods have their own theme, which is very haunting. Kid's theme actually comes from Radical Dreamers, although the arrangement is slightly different. It's one of my favorites. It's so breathtakingly beautiful and haunting. Fort Trigonia is another favorite of mine, starting out with some jazzy piano chords, and then a pipe organ just comes in and changes the whole mood. Chronopolis is another really good theme, very intriguing with just a hint of climatic energy to it. People Imprisoned by Destiny is very somber and beautiful. Fargo's Ship is a bop. The underwater theme is so relaxing and tranquil. The theme of the Frozen Flame comes from Radical Dreamers and is very haunting. I love the music that plays when you're back in Kid's past at the burning house. Nothing but jeopardy and urgency filled with pipe organ goodness. The music that plays in the first part of Terra Tower is so unearthly chilling and scary and sends shivers down my spine. The second piece of music that plays in the tower is certainly foreboding, but not nearly as chilling. It is still very haunting. The fight with the Dragon Guardian is epic and urgent and very fitting for a final boss. As for the actual final boss, well, that just might be the best final boss music you've ever heard. I'm guessing they opted not to have any music playing here so that you could better hear the sound of the elements when using the Chrono Cross, which brings us to this game's main theme, simply called the Radical Dreamers. You'll hear an arrangement a few times in the game with a simple music box. The notes that sound when you use the correct elemental colors with the Chrono Cross form a motif from this theme, and when you do beat the final boss properly, you hear a complex orchestral arrangement of this theme, the beginning of which sounds very similar to Shala's theme from Chrono Trigger. The genius of Mitsuda simply blows me away here. And then a vocal arrangement of this song plays during the credits, the lyrics of which are in Japanese, so I don't know what they say. I do have a few complaints about the soundtrack. While most of the tunes are phenomenal, some of them get overused a bit, like the Isle of the Damned. It's a chilling and foreboding theme that I fell in love with the first time I heard it, and then I heard it again. And again, I don't know why it plays in the Hydra Marshes in Another World when Homeworld already has a perfectly good arrangement of that area. And Lizard Rock is great, very funky and jungle sounding, but you don't hear it anywhere else. Same with Viper Manor Bluffs. Still, this soundtrack is amazing and is a worthy successor to Trigger's soundtrack. So at the end of the day, do I consider this game to be a worthy successor to Chrono Trigger? I think so. Its story, while certainly in need of better organization, ties in with Trigger very nicely. We're not doing time travel this time, but we are doing something very similar. We tie up some of Trigger's loose ends. Our our main villain comes right back to Lavos. The battle mechanics are certainly a far cry from what we had back in Trigger, but it's still a good system and works very well. The graphics and music are some of the best on the PS1, and it's simply exploding with replay value. But do I recommend this game for you in 2023? Yes, but cautiously. There are a lot of things about this game, mostly the story, that might be deal breakers for you. But if you're okay with them, then I think you'll find a lot about this game to enjoy, even if you don't like it as much as Trigger.
But thank you so much for watching my review of Chrono Cross. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider checking out some of my other reviews. If they interest you, please consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to check out my music on Spotify. In the meantime, have a fantastic rest of your day. Peaces.